It's Wednesday, October 5th, 2016, and this is 3000 NFL Mock Draft with your host, Kenneth Arthur of fieldgoals.com, and Rob Staten of SeahawksDraftBlog.com. Every week we get together and we talk about the NFL draft, the NFL in general, NCAA. We've spent a lot of time with college football trying to get those prospects in your heads and which guys that you should watch for next season, and maybe perhaps seasons beyond that are currently playing in college. There's been a lot of exciting football in college this season, a lot of big stats, a lot of big offensive numbers in college football, as well as some interesting numbers from the NFL side and young players, rookies, second-year guys that we've talked about in this podcast in the past, coming in and having big games. And we also talk about the Seattle Seahawks, of course, as we are both Seattle Seahawks fans and writers. And so there's going to be some talk there about the Seahawks needs and who they are as a team, as well as everything else. And I don't know if you can hear that in the background, but every time I start to talk on a podcast, somebody turns on a leaf blower. So thank you for that. And let's get started right here. First of all, Rob, how are you?
I'm good. I'm glad that the leaf blowers are making an appearance again, Kenny. As soon as I heard that going off in the background, it reminded me of what you told me last week about the fact that they seem to wait for you to start a podcast, and then it's like, right, Kenny's doing a podcast. Let's get the leaf blowers on now. So good to see that they're with us again this week.
Yeah, I am not kidding when I say that there was not a peep up until we turned on the podcast, and then just like that, out of nowhere. And it's 3:40 p.m. How are you doing yard work right now, 3:40 p.m. on a Wednesday? Why? I can't believe it. But here we are. This is the life of a, podcast in 2016. You do them from home and anything could happen. And I just can't shut out that noise no matter what I do to the windows. So there you go. Hopefully it'll subside soon. Anyway, talking about college football, we've done a lot of talking about Lamar Jackson this week going in Louisville, Clemson, the big game, two top five teams, perhaps the two front runners for the Heisman Trophy facing off against one another in that game. And Clemson pulls out the 42-36 victory. Clemson's defense too much perhaps for Lamar Jackson in Louisville. That being said, Lamar Jackson was still the ninth leading rusher in the nation with 162 yards, 2 touchdowns. I think, being quarterback, it's even tougher to build up those rushing numbers because the sacks, they count against you in rushing. So Lamar Jackson is still showing how good of a talent he can be on that field, and as well being a developing passer that's maybe not quite there yet as a passer. And Deshaun Watson getting out the victory. We talked a lot about it last week, Rob. Now that you've seen the game, now that we know the results, what were your thoughts on that game? Who were the big standout players to you? Was it the quarterbacks, or did someone else sort of step up and say, I'm the difference maker for Clemson, or I'm another guy for Louisville that you should be watching?
I think the one guy who stood out more than anybody else was the linebacker Ben Bulware, who is is a really good player. We talked about him on the podcast a bit last year as well. I don't think he's the type of player that, for example, a team like the Seahawks would necessarily draft, but he seems to me the kind of player that could land in the AFC North, for example, and could carve himself a good career at linebacker. I mean, he was just so amped up for that game. I mean, he played with such an intensity. Every tackle was celebrated. He was determined to leave a mark on that game and win it for Clemson. He sort of stepped up on the big occasion, and I have to say a little bit. I think that the two quarterbacks, particularly Lamar Jackson, to start the game, had to feel his way into it, and perhaps the occasion got to him a little bit. I think there was a little bit of that with Deshaun Watson as well. There was none of that with Ben Bulware, and of course it's a little bit different when you're playing defense, you're playing linebacker, you're running and hitting people, you're not trying to read a defense and throw accurately. But I think the one player who really, really impressed on either side was Ben Bulware, the linebacker.
I saw too Rob Rang on Twitter. He covers the Seahawks. He's scouting for CBS Sports as well as just in general. Does a lot of great work there with scouting at the college level in the draft and the NFL. But is still talking about on Twitter today sort of Lamar Jackson's prospects as a pro quarterback. And I posed the question to him. He hasn't had a chance, I think, to answer it yet, but just posed the question to him about, if there's talk already about him being the next Michael Vick, or, a right-handed Michael Vick or a better Michael Vick, or, maybe like Vince Young if things don't go wrong at the pro level at some point. These comparisons only to quarterbacks, and just wondering, what are the odds to some of the other people out there like Rob Rang of Lamar Jackson simply not playing quarterback at the NFL level? If you could be Terrell Pryor and get those 5 years back of trying to be a quarterback and it just never working out, and now being, an essential wide receiver, a guy that, could play wide receiver for any team in this league. And if you could do that with a guy, like if you could just sort of recognize that with a certain player and say, hey, look, if this is the path you take, you may not get the glory, and there's going to be a transition. Not at the same level as a quarterback. The wide receiver, might be number 2 in glory at the NFL level, if that's how you want to measure it. You catch the touchdowns, you do the dances. There aren't many more popular players in the NFL than there are like Des Bryant. So it's not like you're losing a ton of that, but at the same time, if you could just go out there right now and start being a wide receiver, perhaps, you're going to increase your odds of having a productive NFL career. What would the story of Tim Tebow be if he didn't try to be a quarterback at the NFL level? So with Lamar Jackson, is there where would you stand on that? Because he's not that great of a passer, and Louisville, scoring as many touchdowns they're not going to start worrying. They're not going to worry about making him a pro-ready quarterback. They're going to worry about making him the most productive player for Louisville that they can make him. What do you think the chances are of Lamar Jackson, being a quarterback, and as opposed to just like the odds of just like, hey, when you're finished your career at Louisville, start making the transition to wide receiver?
Well, it's a very complex issue, isn't it? There's sort of different strands to look at it with this. For example, Lamar Jackson actually chose to go to Louisville specifically to work with Bobby Petrino because he felt that this was a pro-style offense, that it would give him the best chance of being prepared to play as a pro quarterback. So there's a kind of an agreement between the team and the player that they were going to help him get there. And, he was highly recruited, and he made the decision to go to Louisville purely because he wants to play quarterback in the NFL. So they're going to give him every opportunity to show that he is capable of doing that. In terms of watching him right now, he's only a sophomore, so he's still got a chance to develop and progress. But as you mentioned, Kenny, he's not a particularly, I would say, an accurate thrower. He is a guy who has got a tremendous arm, and he throws it. It's a laser, but he only throws at one pace. He throws at 100 mile an hour or nothing. And you sort of see that there are throws that he'll throw behind frequently. He will be off target. His timing routes aren't particularly good. He doesn't throw with touch. He throws it deep downfield. And if you get a busted coverage and he spots the guy downfield, then it's very easy for a 60, 70-yard touchdown. That's going to happen less and less as he turns pro. So he has to become more refined as a passer. Then there's the other thing to look at. One of the most effective things that he does is run up the middle. So on the read options, you don't get a lot of quarterbacks who will run up the middle on a read option, or will just take a endless QB draws up the middle. There are very, very few quarterbacks who do that. He has a lot of success with that. If he can find a crease, he'll take it, he'll explode. It's a 30, 40-yard run, if not more, and a touchdown. At the NFL level, you just can't do that. There's one quarterback in the NFL who can run up the middle, and it's Cam Newton, and because he's about 6'5" and 250 pounds or whatever. He's built like a linebacker, so he can, and a big one at that, so he can sort of plow up the middle and take that beating, and it's not hampered him too much in his career so far. Lamar Jackson is about 6'1", I think, or 6'2", and about 200 pounds. He's stick thin, really. He's not going to be able to take and withstand the beating of running up the middle against NFL defensive linemen and linebackers. So you're sort of talking about his game at the next level is going to be completely different, or it's going to have to be refined a little bit here. And while I think it's cute to sort of talk about him as an NFL quarterback right now and sort of imagine that he could be a Michael Vick or something like that, there's still a long, long, long way for him to go to prove that he's capable of that. And when I watch him play, and there's definitely something there, I can't help but feel like he's the kind of guy who's going to give it a go at quarterback, but ultimately he's going to end up playing probably wide receiver at the next level. He's built for that. His speed is incredible. I think he's definitely an X factor in the open field, and I think he could be a pretty good player there. But I suspect that he will give it a try at quarterback. And given that there are so few great quarterbacks in college football right now, I wouldn't be surprised in a year's time if somebody does take him very early and takes a chance on him. After all, somebody did spend a first-round pick on Tim Tebow. So there's every chance that someone will spend a first-round pick on this guy.
We talk about Lamar Jackson, as a national figure that can, hold relevance in Seattle because of how important he is to college football, how big of a name he is, the things that he does every week. And so it's relevant to talk about that anywhere you are. But now talking about something Seattle relevant that is now on the national stage, the University of Washington Huskies, ranked 5th in the nation. They were hosting number 7 Stanford this weekend, and they blew them out 44-6. Definitely the University of Washington's biggest win, dating back probably 15 years. If you really want to talk about the Huskies at a time when they were competing for something real, which is a national championship, needing, this is their biggest game of the season on the schedule. It's easily the toughest team that they will face all year long, barring something surprising. So they needed to get, a victory any way they could. Just coming out of an overtime win over Arizona, you didn't know what was going to happen, and they blow them out 44-6 in this game. And Jake Browning, the quarterback on the season, is now completing 70% of his passes, a little bit more, 9.6 yards per attempt, 17 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. They've got a strong running game with Myles Gaskin and Lavon Coleman, and they've got some strong receivers with Chico McClatcher and John Ross, and Dante Pettis leading the way in receiving yards. And it's going to be something to watch there offensively for the University of Washington Huskies. And you look at the rest of their schedule, and it's like, who do they lose to? They got Oregon this weekend, who they haven't beaten in 13 years, but Oregon just got blown out by Washington State, or giving up a ton of points. And Oregon sits at 0-2. They just turned into a new quarterback. Oregon State, Utah, Cal, USC, ASU, and Wazoo. They don't have another team on the schedule that's ranked except for number 24 Utah, barely getting into the top 25. Other than that, I don't know who the Huskies lose to going into a Pac-12 championship. And then who's their Pac-12 championship match going to be against? Colorado, currently number 1 in the South, maybe Arizona State, maybe Utah, but those are teams that they'll play later in the year. So if they beat them, obviously they're going to be handing a conference loss to one of those teams. So, I don't know. The Huskies may, have the easiest path of any of the teams currently ranked in the top 5 to get to that Final Four. And if they get to the Final Four, anything could happen. But maybe the thing to focus on isn't the offense, it's the defense. Rob, there's quite a lot of interesting players on the defense, right? What do you see with the University of Washington Huskies, and, what stood out to you in that game against Stanford?
Well, I think generally speaking, the thing that's going to probably be the biggest issue for Washington is just whether they're ready. I don't think anybody would deny that based on what we've seen in the Stanford game, they've got the talent to go undefeated, as you just talked through there. There's nobody on the schedule that sort of stands out as being a real threat. I mean, Oregon might end up being their toughest game, and Utah on the road will be tough, but maybe that mental thing of not having beaten Oregon in so many years will be a test for them. But when they went to Arizona and scraped through in overtime in a game that they really, really should have comfortably won, it showed that this is a team that maybe still just lacks that mental maturity, to get a job done. And you won't see many of the teams in the top 4 above Washington go into a team like Arizona and squeaking by. They will win that game handsomely. And the other thing that maybe works against Washington a little bit is if they do lose one game, because their schedule is so, it's a cream puff schedule, that it's going to work against them. They're not going to have beaten really anybody who is particularly impressive. And I know Stanford are ranked number 7 going into that game, but they are not the 7th best team in college football. So, it's going to be a nice test for them. It's a shame I'm not going to get the Oregon game over here, but I'm very intrigued to see how they're going to get on in that one. I am going to be attending the Arizona State game on the 19th of November, so hopefully they'll be in a position by then that they're still in contention, at the very least for the Pac-12, and if not for the playoffs. Looking at this game in particular, I thought there was the defense just was fantastic. And while Jake Browning's going to get a lot of attention, and he was fine. And the running backs get a lot of attention, and Ross and the receivers do well. It's clear that the strength of this Washington team is defense, and there were so many impressive performers. I thought Azim Victor, the linebacker, was absolutely fantastic, and he was all over the field. I think he got 11 tackles in the end. Great read and react, and was just flying around there, quick to the ball. And I just thought he was so impressive. But then he was playing behind just this freakish-looking defensive line. Elijah Qualls was excellent, the junior defensive lineman, big guy. I thought that Greg Gaines, that sack that Greg Gaines had, a sophomore, he's a huge guy. But the sack that he had, he must be plus 320 pounds. And the sack that he had, where he kind of just swimmed his way into the backfield, brought down the quarterback, was absolutely sensational. And he's going to be a very, very interesting player to watch over the next year or two. And then the other sophomore, Vita Villa, was excellent as well. And you're talking about three guys there who are absolutely massive, 320, 330-pound guys who are quick, who are mobile, who are just dominate in the trenches. And I think that they are a foundation for Washington to be good for a couple of years. You know, if Qualls comes back next year as a senior and stays with Villa and Gaines, you know, they are going to be formidable. And then I think that it all works as a package. You know, they've got the great interior guys, and it helps their edge rushers. It keeps them clean because they just absorb so many blocks on the interior that someone like Joe Mathis was getting one-on-ones all game and had the best game that I've seen he have. And he's a smaller guy, 6'2", 255 pounds. He had a couple of sacks in this game, was relentless throughout, just looked like a bundle of energy. And, it was just a great performance from him. And the other Wuchin, the other edge guy, had 3 sacks and was really good as well. And we've mentioned all these players that are really impressive. And then I've not even touched on the secondary. And they've got Sidney Jones back there. They've got King, the safety. They've got Buda Baker, who is very likely to go in the first round, I would say. And it's just an incredible defense. And if you want to take on the best in college football, if you want to match it up with an Alabama or an Ohio State or teams like that, you've got to be better than good on defense. You've got to be exceptional. And what the Huskies showed the other night and the talent they've got on defense, they look like an exceptional defense. I just wonder whether, as a team, are they ready for this? Are they mature enough to run the table, be undefeated, get into the playoffs? Remember, Ohio State and Michigan will play each other. They're both currently in the top 4, so one of those will lose a game. And with the Huskies at 5 currently, if they win out, they're probably going to be in the playoffs because one of Ohio State or Michigan will lose. So unless they're going to put a one-loss team in there ahead of the Huskies, and with that game being, I think it's the last game of the regular season for both, it will stay in the memory of the playoff pickers. I think it's going to be crucial. I do think Michigan will lose more than one game this year, by the way, but Washington's got every chance of getting in there, but they've got to show that they can win the games now that they are supposed to win.
Speaking of the Huskies, the Huskies have had some notable tight ends in history. Jeremy Stevens was a notable tight end for the University of Washington that played for the Seattle Seahawks, and Austin Seferian-Jenkins was one of their most highly recruited players during their worst seasons, and then recently drafted in the second round by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Got another DUI recently, was released by the Bucs, picked up by the Jets, and is currently, trying to get back up to speed and catch on with the Jets, and we'll see what happens to Jenkins. But speaking of tight ends, the Seahawks, we've seen what has happened with Jimmy Graham over the last 2 weeks and just how important and how special of a player he really is, that he really can be a game changer on offense and take that Seattle Seahawks offense and Russell Wilson to the next level by being able to be this gigantic target that you can trust and you can throw into it when he's covered and not feel too worried about it, and be a big red zone threat and do everything that the Pete Carroll has dreamed of since coming in 2010, and trying to find that big guy like Mike Williams or Sidney Rice or Zach Miller, and not being able to find it until now, really, with Jimmy Graham. That being said, Jimmy Graham is always going to be a little bit of a concern as far as, wanting to get through this season healthy and showing no adverse effects from the torn patellar tendon. And then his backup, Luke Wilson, is going to be a free agent after this year. I've already sort of been on record in saying that I don't think there's a good chance the Seahawks re-sign Luke Wilson based on contracts that we've seen around the NFL for guys of similar production and size and athleticism of Luke Wilson that haven't been that productive but got pretty good contracts, like Kobe Fleener and Ladarius Green. So I think that there's some other team is going to give Luke Wilson a starter's value, which the Seahawks cannot pay Jimmy Graham and Luke Wilson as starting tight ends. So I think there's a good chance they're going to have to go out and get another tight end. They've got Nick Vanett, the rookie, who has not yet played. They've got Brandon Williams, though he is, not really played on offense this season, and we don't really know how he would perform in a regular season game on offense as a tight end for the Seahawks. So it's, tight end could be a need, if not this year, then next year. Rob, I know that there are some tight ends that you are interested in this draft next season. And we've talked about O.J. Howard. We talked about Jake Butt last week. But you brought up my attention, Evan Ingram for Ole Miss, and looking at his game log, I'm seeing some pretty good games against some really good teams. What do you What do you think about Evan Ingram and his fit with the Seahawks, or where you think the Seahawks might even be looking for a tight end in next year's draft round wise?
Well, I think it's definitely a possibility just because, as you mentioned, Luke Wilson is going to be a free agent. We don't know what's going to happen with him. The Seahawks don't have many free agents coming up. I think that Wilson probably going to be the most high-profile one. The likes of Deshaun Shed are restricted free agents. Gary Gilliams have restricted free agents, so they will have pretty much cheap control over those two guys. And it's basically players like Bradley Sowell and Kelsey McRae that are also free agents. So, you're not talking about a big group. If there is any free funds, I think the off season is probably going to be a time when they will sit down with Michael Bennett and try and give him an extension. So, that's going to take up a lot of money. They might start to look ahead. There might be guys whose contracts are running out, like Bennett's. I've not had a serious look at this through this list of players that might be up in 2017. Jimmy Graham is one of those. And this is another reason why I think they may just look at this, because Jimmy Graham's contract actually expires after the 2017 season. So that's at the end of the next year. Jimmy Graham will be into his 30s at that point, and we will know by then, how dominant he still is. If he's getting up to sort of age 32, now he might be the kind of player like Tony Gonzalez, who plays well into his 30s. Physically he looks fantastic, so there's at least a chance that could happen. And we've seen Jason Witten, who's another tight end who's played for a long time. He could be one of those guys. They may well pay him and choose to keep him in Seattle. But, it could be that in 18 months' time, they're looking at a situation where Luke Wilson and Jimmy Graham are no longer part of this team. Now, they did draft Nick Vanett. Perhaps, this year they wanted more of a blocking tight end, perhaps with an eye to the future as well. But I just think that the league has changed so much, Kenny, that, what we are seeing now is the big mismatch target is so crucial these days. If you've got somebody who can run incredibly fast and has got size, we're seeing less and less plodding possession receivers now. We are seeing dynamic, sudden, smaller receivers, the likes of Odell Beckham and T.Y. Hilton and Will Fuller, Amari Cooper, Stephon Diggs, Antonio Brown, those types of players. And we're seeing sort of the big hulking physical monster like Julio Jones and AJ Green and Mike Evans and people like that, and Gronk and the tight ends like Greg Olsen are having a big impact in the passing game. Jimmy Graham has obviously started to perform again for the Seahawks. Terrell Pryor has emerged as well. This is what the league's about now. And if you can get size and athleticism at the position, I think the Seahawks would consider adding another one. Now, it doesn't have to be a tight end per se. I think the most orthodox tight end is Jake Butt. I think that the Seahawks would probably show some interest in him because I think overall he's a very good player, great character. O.J. Howard is maybe more complete than Evan Ingram, and again, an incredible athlete with huge upside in the passing game and as a blocker. But I think if you can find somebody who can act as a receiver, who can line up in line, off the line of scrimmage as a slot out wide, then those players are like gold dust. And, why not keep adding them to them? And if you think you might lose your tight ends and, you look at that, there is room on the roster for a big receiver. At the moment it is Tanner McAvoy, who scored the touchdown the other day. But, is he a long-term feature of the offense? Can he develop into something? Or is he going to be the kind of guy who's on the roster for a year, then has to fight for his place in a year's time? Evan Ingram is somebody who should be, I think every Seahawks fan should just keep an eye on, because if you go on the blog right now, there's a great highlights video of him. You've seen the Odell Beckham doing the one-handed catch thing. Well, Evan Ingram can do exactly the same thing. There's a video on the blog. It's an article that I posted a couple of days ago. Go and watch that and watch him doing one-handed catches in practice. It is unbelievable. You mentioned his production. If you take away a game against Wofford, which Ole Miss, I think they rested most of their starters for most of the game. I think he got something like 2 catches, 40 yards in that game. But if you take the Wofford game away, he's played Florida State, Alabama, Georgia, and Memphis so far. So 3 of the 4, some of college football's elite teams. He's averaging 109 yards a game, over 16 yards a catch, and he's got 4 touchdowns in those 4 games. He is playing fantastic football. His ability to work the seam, to work out wide, to catch pretty much everything. He's got an incredible vertical leap. The touchdown he had against Georgia was superb. He just leapt off the ground. It's like he was standing on the cornerback's shoulders who was covering him. He's got an immense character. I just think everything about him is fantastic. And I see people sort of touting him as a possible second-round pick. Yet when I watch him play and I see everything about him, I just think this guy's going to go in the first round. There aren't many players like him available. And I just think that if we're talking about Jake Butt and O.J. Howard as first-round picks, then it's about time we looked at Evan Ingram as the same. And unless he runs something stupid like a 4.7 at the combine or a 4.6, given his size, he's about 227, 230 pounds. If he runs in the 4.4s or the 4.5s, which he's more than capable of, then we're talking about a player who's, for me, far superior to Eric Ebron when he came into the league. And Eric Ebron was the 10th overall pick. So why is Evan Ingram not getting a bit more attention?
We spoke a lot about Florida's defensive backs last year for the draft, and Keanu Neal, the safety, was one of your favorite players in the draft, if not your most favorite player as far as what's going to happen at the next level, and an exciting guy. Vernon Hargreaves, we talked a lot about for different reasons and how you thought maybe he was overrated, but definitely a highly touted player and perhaps the most high-profile cornerback in the entire nation last year, and he does go 11th overall or 12th overall in the draft to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. But it doesn't end there for Florida. This is a team that is up for consideration as DBU with a few others like Texas and LSU, that they produce all of these really good, interesting defensive backs from safeties to cornerback. But right now, one of those guys is Marcus May, who seems to have caught your attention. I know that you like a lot of Florida's players in general. I don't know why it never comes together for Florida, but what do you see with Marcus May, and why do you think that Florida can't get it together to get another national championship after all these years, despite having so many talented players?
I think because they're a really lopsided team. They are, for a few years now, they have been heavily superior on defense than offense. Tebow was effective as much as he wasn't a great passer. He was effective for them. Urban Meyer has an offense that, he went to Ohio State and they immediately started scoring points and scoring touchdowns. His offensive scheme is a well-oiled machine. So, you lose Urban Meyer, you lose Tim Tebow, and you suddenly start trying to, I think Will Muschamp came in, a very defensive-minded coach, didn't really put an offense together that was challenging teams. He moved on. And now they have an offensive-minded head coach who did a great job at Colorado State. But when he got to Colorado State, there was quite an orthodox pocket passing quarterback for him there who was putting up a lot of numbers, and he was able to have some success. The problem they've got at Florida is that they're trying to build that offensive mentality now, but without the quarterback. They've gone through years of recruiting without a great quarterback, and now this new coach has come in and he's trying to find one. They have actually got Jack Del Rio's son, Kenny, as the quarterback at Florida. So Jack Del Rio, the Oakland head coach, his son is the quarterback at Florida, but he's injured at the moment. There is a lot of hope that he can develop into, a really good player, but he's injured. They're starting a guy called Appleby at the moment, who's a transfer from Purdue. That's what they're having to do. They're having to get transfers from Purdue to to come and play quarterback for Florida because they are that desperate for an offense. So the reason why it's not really come together for them is because of the offense. Defensively, for years, they have just been sensational. They get most of the big defensive-minded recruits in the state. If you want to watch, I would recommend, if anybody wants to watch a defense that is just full of players that you're going to be seeing on a Sunday, then Florida is the one to watch with Alabama, because you've got Caleb Brantley, the defensive tackle, who was fantastic. He was the best defender on the field against Tennessee before Derek Barnett took over the game. You've got Quincy Wilson, the cornerback, as well as Tease Tabor. They've got two really good cornerbacks there. Marcus Mays is, the guy that you mentioned. I'll come on to him in a moment. But then you've got Alex Anzalone, who we've talked about, who I think is just a Clay Matthews clone, not just the hair, but the style of play. You've got Jared Davis, who's a brilliant linebacker there as well. It is just an incredibly loaded defensive roster. Marcus May is a really interesting player. Now, I loved Keanu Neal. Not many people thought Keanu Neal was going to go as high as he eventually did, but I was not shocked at all. And I think that's a great pick and will prove to be one of the best picks that Atlanta have made in a long time, perhaps since the Julio Jones pick. So you look at Marcus May, he is very, very similar to Keanu Neal. And if you go and watch the tape of the two of them playing together, sometimes it's hard to work out who's who. Now, he will line up in the box, and will set the edge against the run. I mean, he's only like 6'1", I think 6'1", 210 pounds about, maybe 215, but he sets the edge against the run. I mean, he's that physical even for his size. That is really difficult to do for a safety who is not sort of Cam Chancellor's size. He's great in coverage, does very well against tight ends. I watched today, funny enough, Kenny, I watched Michigan against Florida from the Citrus Bowl. It was a very one-sided game. But watch Marcus May coming up against Jake Butt. There was one play where they throw to Jake Butt across the middle. Marcus May just flies in there, just gets the little fingertips of the ball, forces Jake Butt to drop the pass because he just gets enough on it, Marcus May. It's a really, really athletic play. Hits really hard, forces so many fumbles. I mean, he is around the ball. He's got maybe the same neck as Byron Maxwell, punching the ball out. There's a real art to that, and Marcus May has got it. I just think that he is seriously underrated. And I think there's, nobody's talking about Marcus May as a first-round pick. The more I've watched this week, and I've sat down and watched a lot of Florida stuff to watch a lot of their guys, I think that Marcus May has got every chance of emulating Keanu Neal and going in the first round next year.
I want to transition to the NFL and give ourselves, we don't usually, it seems like we don't give ourselves a ton of time, especially, if we're trying to, give the listeners an episode under 2 hours. So, transitioning to the NFL to give ourselves something to talk about here. The Seattle Seahawks, of course, is usually our focus. They go to New York and they play the Jets and they beat them 27-17. The defense allowing quote unquote 17 points. Of course, one of those touchdowns coming on a 42-yard fumble return by the New York offense. Very unusual play, a play that had not really been defended because they thought that it was over. So overall, the defense has another strong game other than, one drive at the end of the first half in which Ryan Fitzpatrick was really able to do a lot of what he wanted to do on that drive unusually. And Brandon Marshall getting a step on Richard Sherman, another thing that is quite rare, though Brandon Marshall is one of the best receivers and an incredibly experienced receiver who, is going to give Richard Sherman all he can handle. And still Sherman comes away with 2 interceptions, nearly has a third, really had a solid overall game. Look for that on fieldgoals.com tomorrow and on Facebook. We've got our guy Samuel Gold doing an excellent breakdown of Brandon Marshall versus Richard Sherman. So look out for that. But the offense, rolling again at certain points. They've put up 64 points in the last 2 weeks against the 49ers and Jets, and they get a bye this week with a lot of people, saying Russell Wilson, should he play? He's too hurt to play. Why not just go into the bye, try and get a win here with Trevone Boykin? But of course, Russell Wilson plays incredibly, and Jimmy Graham plays great, and Doug Baldwin is a great receiver, and the offensive line holds up with Justin Britt, having his best game maybe of his career, just because he goes out there and he's a center and he goes up in such a difficult matchup and he does excellent. And so they've got something there with Justin Britt and the interior, and the debut of Jermaine Ifedi, the first round pick by the Seahawks this year. Rob, with that debut and with their performance on the road in the morning on the East Coast, what are your thoughts on the Seahawks this week and after 4 games headed into the bye?
Well, I think they've played very, very well. I think there's a lot to be encouraged about. I think the whole Russell Wilson thing, I think part of the issue with sort of the thought process that maybe he should sit was, we want to see Russell Wilson 100%. And I think Seahawks fans feel like for Russell Wilson or for the Seahawks to have a real chance of winning a Super Bowl, they need Wilson sort of scrambling around and making the plays and being the complete package that we've come to know him as. And I think that he kind of just proved that doesn't necessarily have to be the case this weekend. The NFL is filled with, the best quarterbacks having to play through horrendous injuries because they are essentially what carries the team forward. I remember a few years ago, and we're going back a few years now, but Philip Rivers actually played a playoff game. I want to say it was in New England or Pittsburgh. I can't remember where, but he may even have played against Indianapolis. It was one of sort of the teams in the I think maybe in the AFC Championship game. He played in that game with a torn ACL. And that's just the kind of thing that these quarterbacks do. I mean, like Big Ben makes a big drama every time he's hurt, but he's played through a lot of injuries in his career. Peyton Manning played through injuries before he obviously had the year off. Tom Brady's played hurt. This is what these guys do. And if Russell Wilson says that he's good to go and he's going to play, then the Seahawks are more often than not going to play the guy. And I think he showed that he can do it. He can, if he is hobbled and if he's not going to be 100%, he can still win you a game of football playing exactly the way he played at the weekend. I thought the chemistry between him and Graham was sensational. I thought Wilson was right on it and just looked fantastic, looked like a top 5 quarterback. I think that the running game will certainly get better the healthier that Russell Wilson gets, because teams will have to account more for him getting out of the pocket and will have to account for him doing everything that he does. And it's harder to just sort of pack everybody in there and shut down the run because they're going to have to think about Wilson on the run. So, that will get better with time. I thought the offensive line were superb, Kenny. I don't know what you thought about them, but I thought their blitz pickup was right on it. I don't think people have talked about that enough this week, that Todd Bowles' defense is all about the blitz. And it's not just about your top 5 guys against their 4 or 5. It is about, can you pick up a blitz? Can you identify what they're going to throw at you, and can you pick it up? And Wilson and his offensive line and his running back, they did that all game. Christian Michael, the offensive line, Wilson, they picked up every single blitz pretty much that New York threw at them, and it led to some time in the pocket for Wilson to carve them open. And then I think on defense, there are a few issues, the little things that they worked out. The Sherman-Marshall battle was fantastic. Bilal Powell seemed to get open a lot underneath, but they took that away in the second half. The touchdown at the end is frustrating, but if you take that away, it's a 27-10 win away from home. And how often do you do that? And it's not like the Jets are the 49ers or anything. The Jets are a team that won 10 games last year and should have won 11. So, they're a tough opponent who were hurting, were looking for a bounce-back performance, and the Seahawks just controlled that game and looked like a contender. And the other positive thing, Kenny, is while the Seahawks seem to be getting stronger and stronger and stronger as the year goes on, Carolina's 1-3, Arizona's 1-3. And, I hope this isn't tempting fate, but you look at the teams who are 3-1 and 4 and zip, like Minnesota and Philadelphia, and are you really fearing them right now? Do you feel like you can't catch them for the number 1 seed? It's there for the Seahawks. The road is paved for them. They've just got to get there now.
One interesting thing to me that I'm considering writing about right now is the Doug Baldwin-Russell Wilson connection. Russell Wilson, when throwing to Doug Baldwin since the start of 2015, is averaging 12.1 adjusted yards per attempt. So what are adjusted yards per attempt? Adjusted yards per attempt are literally yards plus touchdowns times 20 minus interceptions times 45, and then you take that number and you divide it by attempts. So it's about efficiency, it's about scoring, it's about picking up chunks of yardage, and it's about interceptions. So knowing that you can trust that when you throw that to the receiver, it won't get picked off. So for Russell Wilson, you think about, and Doug Baldwin, you think about high percentage of catches. So you know that he doesn't have drops, that he catches a high percentage, that he has a high yards per target because you divide it by attempts, and that he's scoring and he's not getting intercepted. So what does that mean? 12.1 adjusted yards per attempt. We know yards per attempt. Most people know the yards per attempt. Generally, when you get to 8 for a quarterback, that's really good. I think looking at it strictly from a receiver's point of view, maybe you'd look at something like you want a receiver, a great receiver, to have maybe 9 yards per attempt, 9 to 10. So for 12.1 adjusted yards per attempt, where does that rank around the league for some elite receivers, guys that we all generally agree are great? Since the beginning of 2015, Ben Roethlisberger, when throwing to Antonio Brown, has an adjusted yards per attempt of 9. Antonio Brown, often considered the best receiver in the NFL, no worse than top 5. That's 9 compared to 12.1. A.J. Green, when getting thrown to from Andy Dalton, just Andy Dalton, not the other guys, 10.4. Tyler Eifert, 11.5, actually higher adjusted yards per attempt. Why? Because higher percentage of catches, and I guess, less of them being intercepted. So 11.5, still not in Doug Baldwin's territory. Julio Jones, when getting thrown to from Matt Ryan, 10.5. Odell Beckham Jr., 9.3. Calvin Johnson last year, 8.4. Jarvis Landry, catches a ton of balls, catches everything. And it doesn't pick up a lot of yards per attempt. Going Ryan Tannehill, 6.9, so it's not even close. Stephon Diggs, this season, in his gigantic season that he's having, 11.6, so it doesn't even touch Doug Baldwin. Nobody does. Larry Fitzgerald, 9. John Brown, 9.3. Rob Gronkowski last year with Tom Brady, 11.3. Willie Snead from Drew Brees, 11.5. That's how gigantic this 12.1 number is. By the way, Jimmy Graham this season, 13. And Doug Baldwin remains at 11.6 when you take out all those touchdowns he scored last season. He's still at 11.6. The Doug Baldwin-Russell Wilson connection is arguably the best connection in the NFL since last season. And as he doesn't get all the hype, but right now, Doug Baldwin is on pace for over 1,300 yards. He's catching an unbelievable 77.4% of the balls thrown his way, and he's on pace for just under 100 catches. Rob, what you've seen out of Doug Baldwin this year, is it surprising to you that he's sort of keeping up with the production that he had at the end of last year, notwithstanding the fact that he's not going to score 30 touchdowns, which is, the ridiculous pace that he had last year, but that he's still going to, on pace to score 8, and you could see him scoring 10. Are you surprised with how much Doug Baldwin has continued to be Russell Wilson's, safest player, even with Jimmy Graham emerging back as an elite threat? And do you think that Doug Baldwin is an elite receiver?
Yeah, I think the word elite is used too often at times, but I think that he's right. I'm not surprised at all, because, the thing about Doug Baldwin is it's kind of hard to forget, how he came into the league. But I remember as a free agent in 2011 and watching the preseason games, and he just stood out. It just looked like he belonged, even at that early stage in his career. And he had a really good rookie year, and then kind of it slowed down a bit in 2012, and then as he's kind of grown as a player, I think he's matured a little bit. I think that he has become a real leader on the offense, because they've needed a few of them to step up, with Marshawn Lynch and one or two others, and Russell Okung leaving. And I think that he's kind of filled that void a little bit there. And I think when you watch him play, he's just incredible at getting open. And I think that if he'd played for the New England Patriots, or, a team similar to that for the last 3 or 4 years, he'd probably be right up there in terms of, passing yardage and touchdowns. He'd be among the leaders in the NFL. I think that it's to his detriment that he's played on a team that has not traditionally thrown it as much as others. And it has limited the amount, and it likes to spread the ball around and be balanced. So it's limited his ability to put up the huge numbers. But I think that when all's said and done, I think the contract that he's currently playing on, that he was given recently, will end up looking like an absolute bargain for the Seahawks. I think they get everything from Doug Baldwin. He gives everything for this team, everything. And, watching the connection that he has with Wilson, I just hope that continues to grow and grow, because Wilson is also, I would have to say, Kenny, it looks to me like he's trusting Doug a lot more than he used to. And he's trusting his protection, and he's trusting his eyes a little bit more, and he's staying on plays a little bit longer. Because if you remember the horrible Super Bowl, the one that ended in the way that we won't discuss, in that game, Baldwin was wide open on several plays, and Wilson just didn't see him, and was either throwing the ball away, or he was holding on to it, or he was double clutching it. is scrambling out the pocket. And, Baldwin could have been based on all the times he was wide open, Baldwin could have been the game's MVP in that game. Or at least Russell Wilson would have had it because he was throwing it to him open. And for some reason, he wasn't making those connections. And I think since that game, we've seen it last year and we've seen it in the early stages of this season. It seems like the light switched on there, that they're now finding each other a lot more. And the fact that Jimmy Graham is becoming an even bigger weapon as well, I think it just stands the Seahawks in great stead. They have got, for me, the best slot receiver, and with Gronk currently out, the best tight end, pass-catching tight end in the league right now, with a quarterback who is right on it. And if you can just get this running game going, and with the way the defense is playing, when Pete Carroll flirts with the idea of this being the best team he's had in Seattle, that's why, because there's absolutely no reason, looking at the potential of it, for them not to achieve that. They've just got to get that running game going. They've just got to find that production in the run game to sort of complete things.
Mm-hmm. And, if fans want to start dreaming, the Seahawks have a bye this week, but after this week, they face the Atlanta Falcons. Dan Quinn was in Seattle, obviously, as the defensive coordinator and for 2 seasons, and knows what it's like to have the number one defense or the number one pass defense. And this is something, to behold. And I want to just point out the fact that the Atlanta Falcons have given up 13 passing touchdowns in 4 games. They're on pace to allow over 50 touchdown passes. Mind you, the New Orleans Saints just set an NFL record by allowing 45 touchdown passes. The Atlanta Falcons are on pace to destroy that, despite how productive Matt Ryan has been this season. Throwing 11 touchdowns, the defense has given up 13. So even with Desmond Trufant and Keanu Neal and Robert Alford, the defense is just getting destroyed. And they faced Jameis Winston, Derek Carr, Drew Brees, Cam Newton, and Derek Anderson in those 4 games. But they have given up 24 points, 35 points, 45 points, and 48 points. So Russell Wilson and the offense are going up against a defense in 2 weeks that, is just playing abysmally. And at the same time, when you flip it, the Falcons have the number one offense, the number one scoring offense, and the number one passing offense, and they're going to be going up against the Seattle Seahawks defense. Now, I've always said, I'll give me the defense. It worked in the Super Bowl against the Denver Broncos, and it worked, it always seems to, it worked last Super Bowl with the Denver Broncos defense going up against Cam Newton and the Carolinas' number one scoring offense. So that's something to really watch out for. And Dan Quinn, knowing as much as he knows about Russell Wilson and the Seahawks offense, it'll be interesting to see what he draws up. But this could be a really interesting game, especially at home for the Seattle Seahawks. We are looking ahead a little bit here because the Seahawks don't play this week. But Rob, what do you think about this matchup against the Atlanta Falcons? And what do you think about their matchup this weekend? Because the Falcons this weekend are taking that number one passing offense and facing the Denver Broncos, who have the number one defense in the NFL. At least from that passing, it's been almost just as unbelievable as it was a year ago.
Well, I think it's good that we get this weekend we get to sort of sit back and watch the Falcons and sort of see how good they are, because if we were going into this weekend and it was the Seahawks against Atlanta, I think a few people would be a little bit concerned, having seen the way that Atlanta threw the ball against Carolina, and would think that, Matt Ryan and Julio Jones and the running backs that they have there could cause the Seahawks defense some problems, and they'd be right. I don't think this is going to be the kind of game that's going to finish 20 points to 3 to the Seahawks, for example. I think they're going to concede some plays. They might concede 17 points against Atlanta. It's just a case of whether they can get, 23, 30 points themselves against this defense, which is more than capable. And that's how I think Denver will view this as well. I think that Denver will have a lot of success. The thing to remember with Atlanta is that they're a soft team. They're still a soft team. They've always have been. And Matt Ryan is a quarterback, is kind of the identity of that team, and that he is more than capable of being brilliant. But then, you put a lot of pressure on him. He buckles a little bit. And the Atlanta team is a team that the Seahawks have pretty much, the last time they played Atlanta, they just absolutely handled them in Atlanta. And even when you look back to the playoff game that the Seahawks lost against the Falcons, apart from, they had a terrible first half. They turned the ball over. Marshawn Lynch fumbled the ball. Pete Carroll right before half time. There was a promising drive, and he got a little hormonal, and I think he went for it on. They were going for it, or they ran the ball on third down or something, and they couldn't get the snap off in time. So they ended the half getting no points instead of 3 or 7. And all of those little things contrived to hurt the Seahawks. If the Seahawks had played a clean game of football that day, they would have easily beat the Atlanta Falcons. So, they'll be coming to Seattle, and this is their prove-it game for the Falcons. This is the Denver game, that is. This is their opportunity to prove they belong. So even if they win this game, there's not really anything for them to prove going to Seattle. So it kind of takes a bit of the edge off it. And if they don't win it, then they get a little bit desperate and they think, oh, okay, we're going to lose both these games and be 3-3 after a promising start. So I think it all stacks in the favour of the Seahawks. They get 2 weeks to prepare for this team as well. Traditionally when Pete Carroll gets 2 weeks to prepare for a team, he comes up with a great game plan. I do think that, like I say, that the Seahawks will give up some big plays in this game, but I do think they will win it. And then it kind of builds up because the schedule is going to get tougher from here on in. We're going to find out a lot about the Seahawks off the back of this bye, because then after the Falcons game, they get to Arizona, a place where they've traditionally had a lot of success. They seem to struggle more at CenturyLink against Arizona. The week after, they go to New Orleans and play another horrible defense, but another strong offense. So, that's another test for them. But these are teams that the Seahawks should match up against. The Falcons, Cardinals, Saints, you would look at Seattle's strengths and you would think they would match up with those teams. Then Buffalo at home on Monday Night Football, you would hope that would be a win. And then the New England game against Tom Brady, the first match since the Super Bowl. So, there's going to be a very interesting few weeks to come for the Seahawks.
I want to, before we wrap up, I want to take a little bit of time to sort of look around the NFC. We're a quarter into the season, Rob. So all of the preseason expectations and the unknown, well, we know a lot more now. Not everything, there's still plenty yet to learn. There will be teams that might start out 5-1 and not make the playoffs. Teams that start off 1-3 and maybe they do make the playoffs. It happens, sometimes, and in some cases, I wrote earlier this week that if the Cardinals drop to 1-4, only 12 teams since the mergers have made the playoffs starting out at 1-4. So without Carson Palmer this week, maybe on Thursday night against the 49ers, the Cardinals will really want to, sort of a must-win situation for them. But we know a lot more. So I want to just quickly go through some of these key NFC teams and just sort of, we can talk about them and get your thoughts on them and some of the players and breakout performances and whatnot within them. Starting with the Philadelphia Eagles, who are 3-0 and just had a bye week. They'll come back this week and face the Detroit Lions in Detroit. Philadelphia is number 1 in DVOA by Football Outsiders. Their passing game has been strong. Their passing defense has been strong, and they've managed to give up just 27 points in 3 games. While Carson Wentz, the number 2 overall pick, has played as well as any rookie quarterback to start his career ever, throwing 5 touchdowns and no interceptions. So what are your thoughts on the Philadelphia Eagles after 3 weeks? And how much longer do you think Carson Wentz can keep this up?
Well, they look really good against Pittsburgh. The other 2 games they had were against Cleveland and Chicago. So hard to sort of take much from that. And Pittsburgh are a funny team, really, because they're capable of absolutely steamrolling you with offense like they did to Kansas City. But they're also a team that if you catch them on an off day, they have. I don't think the Steelers' defense is particularly great, and I think that they kind of rely on the offense to set the tone. So I don't know. There's a lot for Philadelphia to improve. I think the best way to sort of sum them up is they're better than we all thought, but they're maybe not as good as some people think now. So Carson Wentz is looking really sharp, and I don't see any reason why he won't continue to play smart football because he's a good quarterback. But the running game's gonna have off days. The offensive line. Have we heard anything about Lane Johnson's suspension yet? I'm not sure we have or not.
I don't think so.
So there's a chance that he could be missing for weeks and weeks. Their receivers are boom or but Matthews, Jordan Matthews is a guy who when when I looked at him about the draft, he was a guy who you couldn't rely on him to catch every pass thrown his way. I mean, he would have sort of 3 or 4 drops a week, and that's continued in the pros. And then you look at the defense, it's really well coached by Jim Schwartz, and he's done a fantastic job there, and he's probably going to put himself in contention to be a head coach again next year. But again, personnel-wise, do you see a team that is capable of absolutely smothering teams like they did to Pittsburgh consistently? I'm not sure about that. I mean, I hope that they're going to regress a little bit, because I'm going to go and watch the Seahawks host the Philadelphia Eagles in a couple of months' time, and I don't want to see a 3rd successive defeat, having travelled thousands of miles to go and watch it. But I do think that, I think that the assessment is right, that they're better than we thought they would be at the start of the year, but maybe not quite as good as some people will have you believe right now.
Yeah, the Philadelphia Eagles, Seattle Seahawks in Seattle on November 20th. The Dallas Cowboys, they've won their 3rd game in a row. They're 3-1. They've recovered to win three games without Tony Romo, starting a rookie running back, and Des Bryant missing the last game. Cole Beasley leads the team in receiving with 23 catches for 279 yards. He's a sort of a Doug Baldwin light, catches everything, but doesn't have quite the same amount of efficiency and production and touchdowns as Doug Baldwin, but still a very solid player. But Dak Prescott, the 4th round pick, hasn't thrown an interception. I believe he had a dropped interception this week, so he got a little bit lucky there. But the NFL record, 131 attempts to start a career without an interception, 7.7 yards per attempt, a passer rating of 98.5. Are there flaws? Sure, but Dak Prescott is just starting his career, and he's played better than Russell Wilson did through 4 games to begin his career. Different situations for sure. Dak Prescott's got a very good offensive line, but you have to be pretty impressed that a guy just drafted in the 4th round can lead the Dallas Cowboys to a 3-1 record. And also, I think Dallas's defense is playing better with Morris Claiborne, who has long been considered a bust to some degree as a cornerback for the Cowboys, perhaps having his best season of his career. Byron Jones apparently playing well, though they need a pass rush of some sort, which they haven't really gotten so far. The Dallas Cowboys and the Seahawks do not play this season, but they should be getting Tony Romo back in Week 8 against the Philadelphia Eagles. Speak of the devil. But, it'll be interesting to see what they do decide to do with Dak Prescott and Tony Romo. And all the while, as we talk about Carson Wentz and Dak Prescott, Jared Goff sits behind Case Keenum in the LA Rams. And it's just like, what would Jared Goff have to do at this point with these 2 other rookies playing so well? What would he have to do this week to justify being the number 1 pick and doing everything that the Rams did to trade up for him? What are your thoughts on Dak Prescott and the Cowboys?
Well, I saw a lot of the San Francisco game with Dallas, and I thought that I think the best way to kind of sum up Dak Prescott is that he doesn't quite have kind of some of the magic that Russell Wilson had, or Cam Newton for that matter. I mean, he's pretty unremarkable. He'll get it, he'll drop back, he'll throw it. He makes good decisions, but I don't think as an improvisational force he's going to be quite as creative as Cam or as Russell Wilson, and for that reason he will never be quite as exciting. But he's very poised. He makes the right decisions. He gets you in and out of the plays, and for that reason, to show that level of maturity as a rookie, it's very impressive. Now, whether his ceiling will allow him to continue to grow and grow and grow and become a special player remains to be seen. But at the moment, he's a good quarterback, and that's good enough for Dallas to be 3-1. It'd be very interesting to see him against Cincinnati this weekend. I think that they, as a team, are going to struggle because defensively they're a poor defense. Dallas's defense is poor. They don't have anything in terms of defensive line. The pass rushers that they were relying on, people like Greg Hardy and Randy Gregory, those gambles did not pay off. They've done a bad job finding answers in the draft. The Gregory pick was a bizarre one. They took a chance on him, knowing what his issues were and knowing that the NFL was probably going to suspend him if he continued with those issues, and he has done. So he's going to miss a lot of time. It was a nice story for them to pick the linebacker from Notre Dame in the draft this year in the 2nd round, but he's injured, and are we ever going to see him take the field? So that was an opportunity for them to take a a pass rusher and get somebody that can build around the defensive line. They did not take it. They took a redshirt guy. Ask San Francisco how redshirt players have lasted for them for the last few years. So their defense is not good enough for a sustained playoff run, in my opinion. And the other thing I would say is that while Zeke Elliott looked really good at the weekend, and I think he's going to be a really good player, they just don't seem to be setting the tone in the run game the way they did with DeMarco Murray a couple of years ago. That offense does not look quite as intimidating and as formidable as it did. I watched that Cowboys team beat the Seahawks in Seattle, and they were in complete control, and they owned the day. They were the more physical team that day, and it was because of the running game and the offensive line. And when you watch them playing, they have a nice running game, but it doesn't look like they're not imposing their will on opponents. So, I just think it's interesting. I think that Tony Romo's time, I heard someone suggesting he should probably retire because of his back injuries, and I think that's possibly going to happen. And Dak Prescott is going to have to hold the fort. But I think this is the big challenge this week. Cincinnati, I think they're at home against Cincinnati, a team that is, one of the best in the AFC. Let's see how they get on in that game and see if they can prove that they are legit contenders in the NFC East. And they would have to be if they get to 4-1.
Quickly moving over to the Minnesota Vikings. Rob, if I called you a little over a month ago before the season started, and I said to you, hey, Rob, guess what? Teddy Bridgewater is going to be out for the season. Devastating injury, won't play in a game. The Vikings will lose Adrian Peterson after 2 games. They will be dead last in the NFL in rushing yards and in rushing yards per carry. They're the worst running team in the NFL by far. And they play at Tennessee, they host the Packers, at Carolina, and they host the Giants. What would your guess have been as to far as what their record would have been at that point?
Well, obviously, like everybody else, it would not be to suggest 4-0.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible what they've managed to overcome at this point, including the losses. Their injuries they stretch beyond that. Matt Khalil is on injured reserve. Teddy Bridgewater, Adrian Peterson, Sharif Floyd is out. They've had incredible injuries all over the field, and they've been dominating by the fact that they have forced 11 turnovers in 4 games and turned it over only 1 time. They have the number 3 pass defense in net yards per attempt allowed, and Xavier Rhodes is being talked about as one of the top 5 corners in the NFL right now. So yeah, what are your thoughts now on the Vikings and their staying power? Because suddenly, out of nowhere, the Vikings have gone from how bad is this going to get to Super Bowl favorites.
Yeah, I think that's a load of nonsense. Really. I mean, I know that they are I think Peter King referred to Sam Bradford as his quarter point MVP, and I kind of laughed at that a little bit because, let's just get some perspective here on the Vikings. They've played Tennessee, who are a bad team, and Tennessee were in control of that game and looked like they were going to win that game. And if memory serves, I think Minnesota had 2 fumble recoveries for touchdowns in that game, which enabled them to take the lead and then finish the game. So they relied on, a certain degree of luck to get past a bad Tennessee team.
Just to give the plays, 77-yard interception return by Eric Kendricks, followed shortly thereafter by a 24-yard fumble return by Daniel Hunter.
That won them the game. Without those 2 plays, they probably don't beat Tennessee. They then play Green Bay in the first game in their new stadium. So there's an emotional, there's that lift that it gives that this is the first game in the stadium. They've got to put a good performance out there. And they won by 3 points. And, congratulations, they won the game. They beat a Green Bay team that is notoriously poor on the road by 3 points, a game that could have gone either way, and you salute them for that, and they move on. They play Carolina. I think what we know about Carolina now, they're 1-3, is that, yep, you know what, that win looked really good at the time, but Carolina's struggling, and they've played Carolina at the perfect time. They go to 3-0, and then they play the Giants, who are a team that just looked absolutely garbage the other day. Odell Beckham was having a tantrum. They couldn't do anything on offense. If I had to watch Eli Manning throw the ball down at the feet of his offensive lineman one more time, I was just going to throw something at the TV. with chasing the game late in the fourth quarter, Eli's dumping it off for 2 yards to get a 3-yard gain. They've not beaten, it's not like they've been to Seattle and won. It's not like they've knocked off the Patriots with Tom Brady. They've had a pretty smooth ride so far with favorable games in favorable environments, and a bit of luck to go with it. Sam Bradford has 4 touchdowns in 3 games, and he's not turned the ball over. But his QBR, I know people don't like QBR, but his QBR in the Carolina game was 40, which is not good. He's not turned the ball over yet, but they're not doing anything spectacular. They're running a very, very simplified offense and relying on the defense to win. And eventually teams will just get enough tape on this offense and they will start to limit it. And a good defense will be able to handle the Minnesota offense. And then Minnesota's defense is going to get under pressure. And look, it's a good defense. They've got some good talent on there. But I'm sorry, but Linval Joseph, Anthony Barr, the Xavier Rhodes, they're not of the standard that the Denver defense or the Seahawks defense or some of the other defenses in the league. So I think it's a nice 4-game story for them. I don't have their schedule in front of me, but I'll be very interested to see how they get on, moving forward. Actually, I've got it now. So who have they got coming up? So they've got the Texans next, which is another favourable game for them. The Texans aren't great. They get to go to the Eagles on the road, a nice test, and people will build that game up. But, again, not the hardest fixture. The Bears to follow that, another easy one. The Lions at home, the Redskins on the road, Cardinals at home, Lions on the road. The best thing that this is an absolute cakewalk of a schedule. So there's every chance that Minnesota will win 13 games because of the schedule and they will get home field or they'll get number 2 seed, but they have the makings of a team that loses the first game in the playoffs. I think that they scream a team that is going to lose in either the divisional round or the NFC Championship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I appreciate the, being cautious because it is easy to look at a team and, they were a playoff team a year ago and they did have a good defense a year ago. So it's not crazy to see them as a good team and that Mike Zimmer is a good coach who is able to get these guys to play, maybe above their heads a little bit. Plus they have a lot of talented players on defense, especially. But yeah, to me, sometimes it's like, what's better than winning, when forcing 3 turnovers, winning when you don't force any turnovers, because turnovers are something that you can to a degree force, but at the same time, many of them are lucky. A lot of the times it's about facing teams that are error prone. If you are facing Ryan Fitzpatrick, look, do I think that the Seattle Seahawks have a great defense? Yes. Do I think that they get 3 interceptions off of Tom Brady? Probably not. Do I think that they get 3 off of Ryan Fitzpatrick? Not that surprising when it happens because it's Ryan Fitzpatrick. A lot of the turnovers have to do with the people that you're playing. So it doesn't shock me to see, them, get 2 interceptions off of Eli Manning or force turnovers. They got 2 interceptions off of Derek Anderson or getting a couple off of Marcus Mariota. It doesn't surprise me at all. Getting 3 against the Green Bay Packers, is pretty impressive, for a team that's being led by Aaron Rodgers, though Aaron Rodgers has had his struggles in the last year and a half, throwing an interception, losing a fumble in that game and having 2 other fumbles. Certainly when you have a disruptive defense and a good cornerbacks, you're going to increase your chances of forcing turnovers. But the Seattle Seahawks, in their run as a great defense from 2012 to present, it's never really been about forcing turnovers. And I think a lot of those teams that force a lot of turnovers and get off those 13-win seasons and make, deep Super Bowl runs or something like that, I think of teams like the 2009 New Orleans Saints that had a great offense and a bad defense that forced turnovers. But what happened the following years when the Saints couldn't force turnovers anymore? The defense became atrocious. So to me, the Seahawks, they were 2-1 this year when losing the turnover battle. And then this week against the Jets, they win it 3-0. And I love that. I love it when they force turnovers. I love it when they protect the football. But to me, it's definitely more impressive if you can get a win when the ball isn't going your way as opposed to when it is every time. Because what are the Minnesota Vikings going to do if they're playing a team that protects the football in the playoffs, which is going to be a lot of the teams? If they're playing a team like the Dallas Cowboys, who are protecting the football right now, I could see that being the team that's a team that gives them problems. If they're facing, one of these teams that's not going to turn the ball over, like a Green Bay Packers again, they'll play them again later in the year in Green Bay. That's, to me, is going to be very telling for the Minnesota Vikings. And Sam Bradford to not throw an interception. I mean, look, he's going into this offense. He's adjusting to a new thing. He's throwing the ball a lot. I'm not going to say that he's not, but they have to some degree play it safe because they know that they don't have this well-oiled machine that's been humming along for a long time. And Sam Bradford is playing so far above his head for a 29-year-old compared to everything he's done up to in his career up to this point, that you would expect some aggression at some point. So, yeah, I think that the Vikings are definitely a good team with a really good defense and maybe a great defense. But with Jerick McKinnon as your starting running back, and he's averaging 3.7 yards per carry, and without any, Kyle Rudolph is going to have a way high career high in targets. And so much is relied upon Stephon Diggs that their number 2 receiver is Adam Thielen. And then they go down to Charles Johnson. I mean, that's really no depth there, to the point where that could be the injury that really hurts them if anything happened to Stephon Diggs. If you have nothing else, then we can move on just to a couple other teams.
Yeah, go for it.
Well, you mentioned the Carolina Panthers, and their fall to 1-3. The Arizona Cardinals, they have fallen to 1-3, and we spoke about them briefly earlier. The Cardinals and the Panthers faced off in the NFC Championship game just last season, and the Panthers blew out the Cardinals. Arizona's had their problems with Carson Palmer, who's now in the concussion protocol. Cam Newton is now in the concussion protocol. And they're having a ton of problems on defense without Josh Norman. They just gave up 300 receiving yards to Julio Jones. They've got no cornerbacks. Benny Benwickery has played terribly. Then they're just throwing out a bunch of rookies, second round, third round, fifth round rookies at cornerback, a position that if you're the number 5 overall pick at cornerback, most people don't expect you to do anything until your sophomore season. So the Carolina Panthers, and they're going out there with Kurt Coleman as the safety, who was, again, playing way over his head last year and was considered pretty bad in some of the other stops that he had in before that. And starting and just throwing in other players there. Trey Boston is the other starting safety. And now you look at Kawan Short. He's just got 1 sack in 4 games compared to 11 last season. Do you expect the Panthers or the Cardinals to rebound to make the playoffs?
Well, I think the Panthers have got the better chance just because they've been in situations like this before. Last year when they won 15 games, I think I'm right in saying the year before they were 7-8-1. Or 8-7-1. It was one of those two.
Yeah.
I think they were 7-8-1. So, and they were about the midway point in the season. They were like 3rd in the division. And I remember Greg Olson was on the NFL Network, and they were saying, we're still going to believe until it's absolutely lost that we can't get to the playoffs. And they made the playoffs in the end because the division's terrible. And they actually won a playoff game against the Cardinals and then lost to Seattle. So, they've been in a similar situation to this where they've been in adversity and they've rebounded back, and they've made a run and got into the postseason. So I would expect the same to happen this year with Carolina. I just don't think that they've got clear issues, and that's, they've got the kind of issues they had a couple of years ago, and they need to find some way to resolve them if they're going to be as strong as they were last year, which is unlikely at this point. Arizona, I just think this is a continuation from what we saw in preseason. I watched a couple of Arizona preseason games, and they didn't look very good. They struggled when Palmer was in there. They struggled when he was out there. He struggled. Nobody was really performing particularly well. I watched the New England game in Week 1. It was a poor performance by Arizona. They gave Tampa Bay an absolute shellacking, but then, who isn't right now? And then they go and got absolutely pasted against the Bills, where they were terrible. And, I saw a lot of the Rams game and on Red Zone, and it was more of the same. It was the Rams Cardinals game was very similar to the Seahawks Rams games that the Seahawks had lost. It was a real battle in there, and it was always going to be like a tight game. But they just seem to be in a bit of a hole right now. And unless Carson Palmer can elevate his play, and unless the offense can find a level of consistency, then they're going to struggle. And the other thing is that, Carson Palmer's he's approaching 40 now. He's an old guy, and Larry Fitzgerald's, well into his 30s as well. And the running back Johnson's fine, but I think he fumbled the ball in the Rams game. I think he's a little bit overrated personally. And then you look at the defense, and it's maybe not quite as good as some people believe, or maybe they believe their hype a little bit too much. So, I'm not sure that Arizona is quite as capable of turning this around. They've got a very tough game on Thursday without Carson Palmer. Drew Stanton has been confirmed that he's going to start that game. And if they lose to the 49ers, then they'll be 1-4, and they will be in serious, serious trouble. And the 49ers have lost a number of players. Bowman's out, Buckner's out. I think the safety they drafted in the first round a couple of years ago, he's out as well. Jimmy Ward. So they're struggling as well. But it's Drew Stanton against Blaine Gabbert. Who knows who's going to win that encounter? So if they were to lose to the 49ers, then the Cardinals would be in a serious hole.
Last one, the LA Rams. Jeff Fisher's got to be feeling good about himself at 3-1, having won 3 in a row, including 3-0 in the NFC West. 2-1 in the NFC West with wins over the two important teams, the Seahawks and the Cardinals. They just beat the Cardinals 17-13. They got 3 road games out of the way, meaning that they still have 7 home games left on the schedule. They've only played in LA once, that being against the Seahawks. And so you would think, hey, the Rams are in first place, and that's a good thing. And they've managed to do it with Case Keenum at quarterback, completing just 55% of his passes, a passer rating of 77.3. Todd Gurley not playing well, 2.6 yards per carry. And despite it all, hey, if you're 3-1, don't sweat the details. That being said, the Rams are still just 24th in DVOA. They didn't score a touchdown until week 3. And hey, the 49ers they beat them in week 1, 28-0. And the Tampa Bay Buccaneers may be the most inconsistent, bad team in the NFL right now, and they beat them 37-32. And the Arizona Cardinals, like you said, not just playing poorly, but playing Drew Stanton in that game for quite a bit. Stanton going 4 of 11 for 37 yards and 2 interceptions in that loss to the Rams. So what are your thoughts on the LA Rams? Do you think that they could actually squeeze out a season that keeps them consistently in the race with the Seahawks into December? Or are the Rams, did they just win most of the games that they'll win all year long?
Well, the Rams have done this before. The Rams beat Seattle twice last year and beat Arizona once, and they still finished 7-9. So they've got this incredible ability to win games like this and get everybody excited, and then go on a 4-game losing streak. I don't believe the hype with the Rams, because they ultimately. There's 2 things to sort of think about them. Their offense is not good. Whenever you've got Case Keenum as your quarterback, he's got 4 touchdowns and 3 interceptions. He's throwing about 55% of his passes, completing 55% of his passes. Teams are basically stacking up the box to take away Todd Gurley, which is presenting Case Keenum with some favorable situations, but it's not sustainable. They have to get that running game going. Just to give you some statistics on Todd Gurley, Todd Gurley started his career last year when he began to play on fire. I think he had some like 4 or 5 consecutive 100-yard games. But then as teams kind of like adjusted and decided they can, if they shut down the Rams running game, they can shut down the team. This is how he performed. 3.8 yards per carry against the Bears, 3.7 against the Vikings, 2.6 against the Ravens, 2.1 against Cincy, 2.3 against the Bucs, 4.4 against Seattle. And then he started the season with the following: 2.8 yards a carry against the Niners, 2.7 against Seattle, 3.1 against the Bucs, and 1.7 yards per carry against Arizona. Teams are just absolutely obliterating the Rams running game. And until they get more of a threat at receiver and at quarterback, that's just not going to change. So the offense isn't good. The defense is good. The defensive line is good. Robert Quinn and Aaron Donald are good. Alec Ogletree is good. Johnson, the cornerback, is good. Is it a great defense? No, it's not. They're a defense that will cause you problems up front, but they're beatable. They don't tackle particularly well at linebacker. They're ill-disciplined. They lose their cool. We've seen that. We saw that in week 1 at San Francisco. And it's cute that the Rams are 3-1 right now, and they're starting to look like maybe they're going to be a threat. But if I don't know, I mean, again, I'd have to look at the games they've got coming up. I think they've got Buffalo next, haven't they? I mean, that's just such a Jeff Fisher loss kind of game. That's just the type of game that he and his team will go and lose. A Buffalo team traveling across the country. Have got a bit of spirit themselves with a couple of wins. That's just the kind of game you could see the Rams losing. Then they go to the Lions, they get the Giants and the Panthers and the Jets. It wouldn't be a total shock if they, were 500 by the midway point in the season. I guess there's only one thing, Kenny, that maybe makes me fear the Rams a little bit, and that's the knowledge that the last relevant season that Jeff Fisher had, the last time that Jeff Fisher managed to coax a winning team and a number 1 seed out of a roster, was when they had Kerry Collins as the quarterback in Tennessee and they won 13 games. Is Case Keenum going to be his next Kerry Collins? Maybe that'll be the case. Maybe LA are going to shock us all and win, 11, 12, 13 games. But I think based on what we've seen so far, it's pretty unlikely. And the teams that they've beaten are the Seahawks with Russell Wilson on one leg, the Buccaneers who are not good, and the Cardinals are on a massive slump at the moment. So it'll be much easier to judge them over these next 4 or 5 games and really see how good they are.
Yeah, it should be, it'll be interesting to see what happens between the Rams and the Cardinals. Conversely, they both have sort of started out in the opposite spectrums of what you may have expected. And, the Seahawks, at least have performed pretty much as you may have expected them to perform, winning against the Dolphins, Niners, and Jets while losing to the Rams on the road, which happens every year. So from that perspective, the Seahawks probably couldn't have asked for a better situation for the Rams to be the team that's 3-1 and the Cardinals to be the team that's 1-3. And then to get the bye week right now, get healthier. We should be seeing the debuts of Nick Vannett next week, as well as someone else that's not hitting the front of my frontal lobe. Jaron Reed should be returning. So not his debut, but I believe he should be returning. And also giving CJ Prosise and Tyler Lockett another week to heal. Thomas Rawls out for an extended period of time. Mike Morgan placed on injured reserve. So we'll see what happens there in terms of the Seahawks getting this bye week and what the standings look like with all the teams that do play this week as they prepare for the Atlanta Falcons, who have that incredibly interesting matchup against the Denver Broncos for number 1 pass offense versus number 1 pass defense, plus Trevor Siemian, who is currently, he missed practice this week, and they might have to turn to Paxton Lynch this week in their matchup against the Atlanta Falcons, who, now we're talking about maybe a questionable passing offense with Denver to maybe the worst passing defense in the NFL with Atlanta. So it's like the opposite's happening there. I guess since I brought it up and since we talked about Paxton Lynch as the best quarterback maybe in this draft class headed into the draft, Rob, I said we had just talked about the last thing, but I got to ask if you saw Paxton Lynch's NFL debut last week when he threw 14 of 24 for 170 yards, 1 touchdown, and no interceptions. Any thoughts there on Paxton Lynch?
Yeah, I thought it looked good. And, it was a favorable situation for him because the Tampa Bay team is not particularly good. But I thought he came out. Didn't see any major mistakes from him. It surprises me more and more every time I consider the situation that the Rams were willing to trade as much as they did to try and get to Jared Goff when they could have had Paxton Lynch for their original first-round pick. Probably could have even traded down and got Paxton Lynch. I think that Lynch and Wentz were the clear 2 best. I think we talked about that for most of the year. I think that Goff going at number 1 was a surprise at the time, and I think it's been proven so with the fact that he's on the bench and the other 2 guys have played some football. I think that Lynch looked pretty good against Tampa Bay, and I think it's going to be sooner rather than later that he's starting in Denver.
There you have it. 3,000 NFL mock draft, 5 weeks of college football in the books, 4 weeks in the NFL. Plenty to like about the Seattle Seahawks, plenty to like about college football, and plenty more to talk about with the 2017 NFL draft. So thanks for listening. Go to SeahawksDraftBlog.com for more from Rob. You can follow him on Twitter at Rob Staten, and me at Field Goals or at Kenneth Arthur S. That's it for this episode and this edition of 3000 NFL mock draft. Stay ahead next time for the next draft. Thanks.